She's a servant, not my daughter, Astraea sneered. Then her fist slammed into my nose. The loud crash was followed by the cruel, melodious laughter of the whole family. Blood splattered across the pristine white porcelain, but Leopold stood tall, his chair crashing to the floor. "Stop!" he roared, his voice like a thunderous rage. "Astraea, you didn't hit the servant. You hit the woman who holds the mortgage on your house. She's my mistress." I closed my eyes, the stinging aftertaste of that night still throbbing within me, a memory so sharp it tasted like copper. I blinked, and the suffocating atmosphere of that room dissolved into the cold, sharp edges of the present. The Chicago skyline was a jagged teeth of glass and steel, biting into the frozen indigo of a 6 a.m. Christmas Eve sky. From my penthouse in the Loop, the world looked organized, manageable, and entirely under my thumb. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights reflecting in my coffee cup, watching the first hints of dawn struggle against the Lake Michigan mist. My phone buzzed against the marble countertop, a secure encrypted line that only 7 people in the world possessed. "The acquisition is live, Phoebe," the voice on the other end crackled with the static of a transatlantic connection. "The board is hesitant. They're waiting for your final word." I didn't hesitate. I never do. In business, hesitation is just a polite word for failure. I watched a lone snowplow clear a path far below on Wacker Drive. "Execute the buyout," I said, my voice steady, devoid of the tremor that usually haunts a multi-million-dollar gamble. True wealth isn't about what you possess, but what you can walk away from without losing yourself. We move now, or we don't move at all. I ended the call, the silence of the luxury apartment rushing back in to fill the space. For a moment, I allowed myself to breathe. In this room, I was the titan. I was the architect of stellar events, a woman who moved markets and managed global logistics with a flick of a finger. But as I turned toward the bedroom to change, the weight of the day began to settle in my chest. Today was the deadline. Today, the titan had to become the ghost. The transition was a ritual of erasure. I parked my car 3 blocks away from the Sullivan estate in Winnetka, hidden behind a row of overgrown hedges. I stepped out into the biting Illinois cold, the wind whipping through my thin coat. I walked the rest of the way, the towering Gothic spires of my childhood home looming over me like a tombstone. By the time I reached the servants' entrance, the CEO was gone. In her place stood the invisible youngest daughter, dressed in a plain, scratchy gray uniform that smelled of cheap laundry detergent and old regrets. I was on my knees on the cold marble of the grand foyer by 7 a.m. The soapy water in my bucket was already turning a dull, muddy gray. I moved the brush in rhythmic circles, the abrasive sound echoing through the hollow halls. Most people see manual labor as a sign of weakness, but for me, it was a final act of patience. Every scrub was a second closer to my planned exit. Every stain I lifted was a reminder of the mess I was about to leave behind forever. "The floor is still dull, Phoebe. Much like your future." The voice hit me like a splash of ice water. I didn't need to look up to know it was Astraea. I could hear the sharp, rhythmic click of her designer heels, a sound that had signaled impending doom for most of my 32 years. She stood over me, the hem of her silk robe narrowly avoiding the dirty water. She didn't see a daughter. She saw a failed investment, a lingering debt that refused to be settled. Fine. My hidden bone conduction earpiece vibrated against my jaw. A crisis was unfolding at the Florida resort project, a logistics nightmare that could cost stellar events a fortune. I leaned my head slightly, activating the collar mic concealed by my hair. "Execute the backup plan," I whispered, the words masked by the splash of the brush in the bucket. Astraea took a step forward, her shadow engulfing me. She kicked the side of the bucket, sending a wave of gray water over my knees and soaking into the fabric of my uniform. "Are you talking to yourself again? It's pathetic. Leopold arrives at 7 this evening. He is a man of standards, a man who values excellence. If the soup is even a degree too cold, or if I see a single streak on this marble, you'll regret the day I brought you into this world." I looked up then. I didn't give her the satisfaction of anger. Anger is a flame that consumes the one who holds it, and I had learned long ago to stay cold. My eyes were clear, focused on the microscopic cracks in the stone beneath her feet. I remembered something I'd read once. Forgiveness doesn't mean allowing someone to continue to hurt you. It means releasing the hope that the past could have been different. I had released that hope years ago. "I understand, Mother," I said, my voice a flat, obedient monotone. "Everything will be perfect." She huffed, a sound of pure derision, and turned away. "See that it is. It's not like you have anything else to contribute to this family. Sarah is out there building a legacy in PR. You're just the help we keep out of pity." As she walked away, the mansion felt even more like a museum, a collection of expensive things owned by people with hollow hearts. I moved to the kitchen, my movements precise and practiced. I polished the silver with a finesse that Astraea mistook for subservience. She didn't realize she was watching a world-class hospitality expert at work. She thought I was cleaning. I was actually conducting an audit of her failures. In a small, forgotten drawer near the pantry, I found a hand-carved wooden bird. It was small, the grain of the wood smoothed by years of touch. My grandmother had given it to me before she passed, the only person in this house who ever truly saw me. I tucked it into my pocket, the cool wood a comfort against my thigh. I whispered a silent promise to the empty kitchen. "I will honor your kindness by being strong enough to be kind myself, even to those who don't deserve it. But kindness isn't the same as weakness." The heavy oak door at the front of the house groaned open. I heard my father, Dalton, enter. He walked past the kitchen, his gaze flickering toward me for a fraction of a second before he looked away. I saw the way his shoulders slumped, the way he adjusted his tie to avoid making eye contact with his own child. His silence wasn't peace, it was complicity. He chose the comfort of Astraea's approval over the dignity of his daughter every single time. I went back to the stove, the heat of the burners warming my face. I had lived in the shadows of this house for 15 years, a titan disguised as a maid. The world thought I was a failure because that was the narrative the Sullivans needed to believe to feel superior. They needed a scapegoat, and I had let them have one while I built an empire in the dark. The doorbell rang, a deep, resonant chime that seemed to shake the very foundations of the Gothic mansion. Leopold had arrived. My heart didn't race, it slowed down. The pieces were finally on the board. Astraea appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face a mask of practiced elegance, her eyes hard as diamonds. She grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin with surprising strength. "He's here!" she hissed, her breath smelling of peppermint and peppermint-covered lies. "Remember your place, Phoebe. You are the help. If you speak a single word of those business delusions of yours or try to embarrass us with your presence, I will ensure you never leave this house again. Do you understand?" I looked her straight in the eye, my face a mask of absolute calm. "I understand perfectly, Mother. Better than you think." The kitchen door swung shut, muffling Astraea's venomous threats but doing nothing to cool the sting of her grip on my arm. I stood in the heavy, spice-scented air of the pantry, my breath hitching as the CEO within me fought to suppress the daughter who still flinched at a mother's touch. A true home is a sanctuary, not a courtroom. Yet every corner of this mansion felt like a witness to my erasure. I had 30 minutes before the first course, 30 minutes to remain invisible. But my family had other plans for my remaining dignity. The silence was broken by the sharp, rhythmic scraping of metal against ceramic coming from the basement stairs. I moved toward the sound, my heart hammering against my ribs. In the cramped, dimly lit storage room where I was forced to sleep, I found Bellamy. Her manicured, sharp fingers were rifling through my limited belongings, throwing my few personal books onto the damp floor. She held my encrypted smartphone, turning it over like a piece of alien technology she couldn't master. "A secret phone, Phoebe? Hidden in a flower jar?" Bellamy sneered, her eyes glittering with a predatory triumph. "Who are you calling? The unemployment office? Or are you playing pretend again?" I didn't answer, my gaze fixed on the way she tossed my belongings aside. Astraea appeared in the doorway behind her, her presence a cold front that sucked the remaining warmth from the room. She didn't look angry, she looked prepared. In her hand was a crisp, notarized document, its heavy seal caught in the low light of the basement bulb. "Since you have time for business delusions, let's talk about real debt," Astraea said, her voice dropping to a low, lethal purr. She thrust the paper toward me. It was a filial debt contract, a grotesque document I had been coerced into signing on my 18th birthday, claiming I owed the Sullivan estate $500,000 for the privilege of my upbringing. "You are a debtor, Phoebe. Under the laws of this state, I can claim every cent you ever make until this is settled. You own nothing. You are nothing." I ran my eyes over the lines of legalese, my mind instantly deconstructing the document. Under Illinois law, a contract signed under such extreme duress and unconscionability was a legal ghost, a piece of paper with no teeth. Yet I felt the familiar weight of the shackle tightening around my spirit. When family becomes a creditor, they cease to be kin. I looked at the signature, my own 18-year-old handwriting, shaky and terrified. "I remember signing this," I whispered, my voice steady despite the claustrophobia of the room. "I remember the way you told me I wouldn't be allowed to leave for college if I didn't. You didn't want a daughter. You wanted a servant with a legal lien." Bellamy laughed, a sharp, hollow sound that echoed off the stone walls. "And a servant you shall stay. But look at you. Even a maid should have some standards." She reached behind a stack of seasonal decorations and pulled out a bundle of gray fabric. It was a moth-eaten, stained uniform that had belonged to a housekeeper who passed away years ago. "Wear this, Phoebe. It matches your soul, secondhand and forgotten." The fabric felt cold and rough in my hands, the scent of cedar and decay clinging to it. It was a deliberate, toxic act designed to break me before Leopold's eyes could find me. Bellamy stood there in her $10,000 designer gown, her beauty a sharp contrast to the rags she expected me to wear. I thought of a sentiment I had once leaned on during the hardest years of building stellar events. No one can make you feel inferior without your consent. "Is this what you need to feel powerful, Bellamy?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "To see me in rags so you can feel like a queen?" "I don't need to feel like a queen," she snapped, stepping over my ruined books. "I am one. You're just the dirt beneath the throne. Put it on. Now." I donned the tattered uniform in the shadows of the storage room, the fabric scratching against my skin like 1,000 tiny needles. I tied the stained apron, my movements slow and deliberate. Kindness is a gift you give yourself, and in that moment, I realized my grace was the only thing they couldn't take. I carried myself with the posture of a leader, my spine a line of steel, the rags unable to hide the authority I had spent 5 years earning. The heavy thud of a luxury car door closing outside vibrated through the basement walls. Leopold had arrived. I could hear the distant, muffled voices of my father, Dalton, and the artificial warmth of Astraea's greeting. The stakes had just reached their zenith. I climbed the stairs, the scratchy fabric of the dead woman's dress rustling with every step. I entered the grand dining hall to serve the first round of water. The room was a museum of wealth, the candlelight dancing off the polished silver and the heavy velvet drapes. Leopold was already seated, his presence filling the room with a sharp, observant energy. He was a man who noticed the smallest fractures in a person's facade. As I approached with the crystal pitcher, his eyes narrowed, his gaze tracking my movement with a terrifying focus. "Leopold, we are so honored you could join us," Astraea chirped, her voice a shrill contrast to the heavy silence of the room. "Please, ignore Phoebe. She's a bit slow. We keep her around out of a sense of Christian charity." I leaned over to fill Leopold's glass. In the dim light, he caught a glimpse of my silhouette. The same silhouette that had dominated his boardroom screen just hours before. I saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes, the way he searched my face for a spark of the woman who had just executed a multi-million-dollar buyout. Astraea, sensing the moment, purposefully extended her foot, tripping me slightly as I moved toward the next guest. I didn't fall. I recovered with a feline grace, my hands steady, not a single drop of water marring the tablecloth. The scratchy gray uniform billowed around me, a shroud of humiliation that felt increasingly like a suit of armor. I could feel Leopold's gaze burning into my back as I beat a retreat toward the kitchen. As the oak door began to close, Leopold's voice cut through the room, low and dangerous. "Astraea, your help has a very familiar way of standing. Where did you find her? She carries herself like a woman who owns the world, not someone who cleans it." I leaned against the kitchen counter, my breath coming in shallow bursts. My bone conduction earpiece was still active, tucked behind my hair. Have you ever felt the exact second your life changed? That's where it all started. The cold Winnetka air seemed to vibrate with Leopold's question, but I didn't linger to hear Astraea's practiced lie. I retreated into the kitchen, the tattered fabric of the dead woman's uniform scratching at my neck like a reminder of my supposed station. My pulse was a steady drumbeat in my ears, the calm of the CEO overriding the anxiety of the daughter. I had a dinner to serve, but more importantly, I had a legacy to protect. As I reached for a stack of linen napkins, a flicker of movement near the basement door caught my eye. The basement was a graveyard of my existence, a place where the Sullivans buried the things they didn't want the world to see. I moved toward the stairs, my steps silent on the stone. The beam of a flashlight cut through the dusty dark below, dancing over the towers of boxes containing Sarah's seasonal wardrobe. In the corner, huddled over my weathered leather satchel, was Bellamy. She was rifling through my private world with a predatory greed that made my skin crawl. She pulled out a thick bound folder, my physical copy of the Stellar Events 10-year national expansion strategy. The embossed gold logo caught the stray light, and for a second, I saw Bellamy's breath hitch. She didn't see a sister's hard work. She saw a lifeline for her own drowning career. She sneered, her fingers tracing the high-quality paper. "Playing business, Phoebe? You probably found this in a trash can at some skyscraper you were cleaning." I stood in the shadows of the doorway, watching her violation. My work is not just paper and ink. It is every hour of sleep I sacrificed and every tear I refused to shed. You can take the page, but you cannot take the mind that wrote it. I felt a surge of profound pity for her. Bellamy was so desperate for light that she was willing to steal the reflection of someone else's sun. She didn't realize that a stolen map is useless if you don't know how to navigate the terrain. The sound of a smartphone camera shutter clicked repeatedly, a rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat in the silence of the basement. Bellamy was scanning every page, her eyes wide with a manic intensity. She whispered to herself, the words echoing off the damp stone walls. "You're just a maid, Phoebe. You're lucky I'm making these ideas actually matter. Leopold will finally see who the real talent in this family is." I stepped back into the pantry as she scurried past, her face flushed with the adrenaline of theft. I knew exactly what was about to happen. A thief can steal a map, but they can never steal the journey. I chose not to stop her. There is a specific kind of justice in watching someone walk into a trap of their own making, fueled by their own arrogance. I took the napkins and headed back toward the dining room, my face a mask of stoic resolve. The grand dining hall was a theater of deception. The candlelight flickered against the heavy silver, casting long, distorted shadows against the walls. As I began serving the second course, a delicate lobster bisque, Bellamy took her seat, her eyes shining with a false brilliance. She didn't wait for the soup to be tasted before she launched into her pitch. She began reciting my complex logistics terminology, her voice confident but hollow. "Leopold, I've been thinking about the national hospitality landscape," Bellamy said, leaning in with a practiced, charming smile. "We need to focus on tiered asset allocation and centralized procurement hubs to mitigate the inflation in luxury catering. It's a strategy I've been developing for months." Leopold leaned in, his sharp eyes narrowing as he listened to her mangled version of my visionary ideas. I could see the wheels turning behind his gaze. He recognized the brilliance of the strategy, the same one we had discussed on our encrypted call that morning, but he also recognized the lack of weight behind Bellamy's words. He looked at me as I lowered the crystal bowl in front of him, our eyes meeting for a fraction of a second. I moved to Dalton, offering him his favorite vintage. He looked up at me, his eyes clouded with a mix of shame and a fear he couldn't name. I caught the tremor in his hand as he reached for the glass. "Thank you, Phoebe," he whispered, so low Astraea wouldn't hear. In that moment, I realized the tragedy of his silence. He wasn't just losing a daughter, he was losing his own soul to the comfort of a lie. True power is not in the words you say, but in the truth you live. I stood at the periphery of the room, a ghost in a tattered dress, watching my sister attempt to build a throne out of my bones. She was performing a role she hadn't earned, using a script she didn't understand. Even the best actor eventually forgets their lines when the director starts asking questions they didn't prepare for. Leopold held up a hand, stopping Bellamy mid-sentence. The clinking of silverware ceased instantly. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. "That's an incredibly specific strategy for asset allocation, Bellamy," Leopold said, his voice a low, dangerous purr. He leaned back, crossing his arms. "Tell me, how do you plan to handle the tax implications for the specialized labor in the Florida resorts under that model?" Bellamy froze, her charming smile faltering like a flickering candle. She looked at Astraea for help, but our mother was busy preening in the reflected glory of the pitch. Bellamy stammered, her mind racing to find a page she hadn't truly read. The table went silent, the only sound the crackling of the fire in the hearth. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. I simply stood there, the invisible witness to the collapse of a lie. The silence at the table was heavy, thick enough to choke on. Bellamy's charming smile had completely dissolved, leaving behind the frantic eyes of a fraud caught in a lie. Leopold's question about tax implications hadn't just been a query. It was a surgical strike. He was testing the weight of the mind behind the words, and he had found only hollow echoes. Astraea's glass hit the table with a sharp click. The sound of a matriarch sensing her fortress was under siege. "Bellamy is far too humble for such dry technicalities, Leopold." Astraea laughed, though the sound was as brittle as dry leaves. "She focuses on the vision. The small details are for the staff to handle. And look who has just arrived. Julian, you're just in time to save us from this dull talk." Julian Thorne stepped into the grand parlor, the scent of expensive tobacco and predatory ambition clinging to his tailored suit. He was a corporate vulture, a man who had built a career on unethical takeovers and the broken dreams of smaller firms. He was also my direct competitor, the man who had spent 3 years trying to bury Stellar Events under a mountain of frivolous lawsuits. To see him here in the heart of my family's home was a betrayal that burned hotter than the fireplace in the corner. Astraea's eyes gleamed with a toxic delight as she noticed Julian's gaze land on me. "Phoebe, get over here," she commanded, her voice ringing with a mock authority that made Leopold's jaw tighten. "Our friend Julian is a real businessman, a titan of the industry. Don't just stand there like a statue. Kneel down and serve him his scotch. Show him how well a Sullivan can serve those who actually have a career." I felt the eyes of the room on me. Julian Thorne looked down, his lips curling in a condescending smirk at my tattered second-hand uniform. He didn't recognize the CEO he had only ever fought through layers of legal counsel and encrypted emails. I moved toward him, the cold hardwood floor biting into my knees as I knelt to pour his drink. The humiliation was a physical weight, but my mind remained a fortress of stoic resolve. A lion doesn't lose sleep over the opinion of sheep. My dignity isn't tied to the position of my knees, but to the height of my spirit. "Thank you, darling," Julian said, his voice dripping with a crude, casual arrogance. "Though I'd suggest the Sullivans invest in some better-dressed help. This one looks like she's been pulled out of a historical archive for the Great Depression." Astraea's laugh was sharp, a weaponized sound. She was spiraling now, her composure beginning to crack as she saw Leopold's growing preoccupation with me rather than Bellamy's mangled pitch. Every time Leopold tried to catch my eye, Astraea would physically move, a sharp, erratic dance of control meant to shove me back into the shadows. She was losing the room, and she knew it. The more I stayed silent, the more powerful I became, and the more frantic she grew. Bellamy tried to regain her footing, launching back into my stolen strategy, But she stumbled again the moment Julian asked about Illinois labor laws. She had no answer. She had the map, but she didn't know how to drive. Dalton finally tried to intervene, his voice a weak, trembling shadow. "Margaret, please," he said, looking at his wife. "Perhaps we should just focus on dinner." "Be quiet, Dalton!" Astraea snapped, effectively silencing the only man who could have stopped the coming storm. I watched her then, and for a fleeting second, I felt a deep, tragic pity. It's a heavy burden to hate so much. She was building a prison out of her own pride, and I was the only one with the key she refused to see. She had spent a lifetime trying to make me invisible, never realizing that the more you push someone into the dark, the better they learn to see in it. The tension reached a breaking point when Astraea suddenly stood up, her movements sharp and jagged. She marched toward the pantry, her heels clicking like a countdown on the tile. A moment later, she returned, her face a mask of triumphant malice. In her hand, she held my personal laptop, the one I had used to build an empire from a basement storage room. "I found this hidden under a stack of flour bags, Phoebe," Astraea hissed, the room going deathly quiet. "Your little toys, your little business fantasies. You think you can be like Sarah? You think you can be like Julian?" "Mother, put that down," I said, my voice low and steady. It was the first time I had spoken as myself all evening. The authority in my tone made Julian Thorne's head tilt in confusion. "No," Astraea smiled. It was a terrifying, hollow expression. She walked to the grand fireplace, where the logs were roaring with a fierce red heat. "Now you are truly nothing. No more fantasies. No more stellar delusions. Just the kitchen, where you belong." She threw the laptop into the center of the flames. The sound of the plastic melting was the only noise in the room. The screen cracked with a sharp, sickening pop. Astraea stood there, her face lit by the orange glow of the fire, looking like a queen who had just won a war. I stood perfectly still. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. My heart was a cold, hard stone. Every byte of that data was encrypted and backed up to the stellar cloud 3 layers deep. The hardware was replaceable. But the act itself? That was final. "You didn't burn my future, Mother. You just burned the last bridge that led back to your heart." Leopold stood up. He didn't move toward the fire. He moved toward the center of the room, his shadow looming over Astraea and Bellamy like a dark cloud. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, dangerous rumble that seemed to vibrate the very air. He looked at the melting plastic in the fireplace. Then he turned his eyes toward Astraea. "Do you have any idea?" Leopold whispered, the threat in his voice more terrifying than a shout. "Whose property you just destroyed?" Leopold's whisper didn't just hang in the air. It froze the very marrow in my bones. Astraea stood paralyzed by the hearth, the flickering orange glow of the burning laptop casting grotesque, dancing shadows across her face. Julian Thorne's smug grin had vanished, replaced by a look of profound confusion as he glanced between the melting plastic and the dangerous stillness in Leopold's eyes. The dining room, usually a theater of staged perfection, now felt like a pressure cooker seconds away from exploding. I moved toward the table to clear Leopold's glass, my steps measured despite the adrenaline surging beneath my skin. This was the moment we had discussed in hushed tones weeks ago. As I leaned in, I intentionally tilted the crystal decanter. A single heavy droplet of Cabernet Sauvignon fell through the air in agonizing slow motion, landing squarely on Leopold's polished Italian leather shoe. It was a bead of deep crimson, a prearranged signal that the mask of the maid was no longer required. Astraea snapped. The sight of her useless daughter supposedly fumbling in front of Julian and Leopold was the final spark to her narcissistic tinder. She didn't shout. She didn't scold. She moved with a primal, jagged speed I hadn't seen since I was a child. Her hand balled into a fist, and before Leopold could even breathe, she struck. The punch was brutal, a sickening thud of bone against cartilage that sent my head snapping back. I felt the sharp, metallic tang of blood instantly flooding my mouth. I stumbled, the world tilting as red spatters fanned across a pristine white Waterford crystal plate like a macabre work of art. The room fell into a silence so profound, it felt deafening. Astraea stood over me, her chest heaving, her knuckles already beginning to swell. "She's the maid, not my daughter," Astraea sneered, her voice trembling with a terrifying lack of remorse. She looked at Julian as if expecting applause for her discipline. "An ungrateful stray who needs to be taught her place. I won't have her ruining this evening with her incompetence." I didn't cry, I didn't fall. I straightened my spine, my vision clearing as I stood with a poise that seemed to radiate a cold, white light. I took the tattered gray rag of the dead housekeeper and wiped the blood from my nose, my movements slow and rhythmic. "You can break the bone, Mother, but you can't touch the spirit. This blood isn't my shame, it's your conviction." I looked at her then, not with hate, but with the terrifying clarity of a woman who had finally seen the bottom of a dark well. The silence was shattered by the sound of a chair being kicked back. It echoed through the Gothic hall like a gunshot. Leopold stood up, his massive frame casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the entire table. He didn't look at Astraea. His eyes were fixed on me with a level of respect that bordered on reverence. "You just committed a felony," Leopold said, his voice a low, lethal vibration that made the silverware on the table hum. He stepped around the mahogany table, his eyes never leaving mine as he moved to my side. He didn't offer a hand to help. He offered the space of a peer. He turned his gaze toward Astraea, and for the first time, I saw the true weight of the man who ruled Pinnacle Hospitality. "This woman," he thundered, his voice shaking the crystal chandelier above, "is Phoebe Sullivan. She is the founder and CEO of Stellar Events. She is the brightest strategic mind I have encountered in 20 years of hospitality. She is my partner, my equal, and as of 3 o'clock this afternoon, she is the woman currently holding the mortgage to this very house. Astraea, you didn't just strike a servant. You struck your boss." The color drained from Astraea's face until she was the shade of ash. She reached for the table to steady herself, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. Behind her, Bellamy dropped her wine glass. The shards scattered across the hardwood, a glittering mirror to the collapse of the lies she had spent the evening telling. Julian Thorne tried to slide back into the shadows of the parlor, but Leopold's gaze caught him like a hook. "And you, Julian," Leopold growled, "we're pitching to a woman who already owns the debt on your firm. You're finished." The magnificent villa suddenly seemed small, cold, and strangely ancient. I looked at the blood stain on the crystal plate, then at the man who had sat silently watching his wife destroy their child. Dalton was stiff, his face rigid with cowardice, a pain worse than Astraea's punch. "To see evil and do nothing is to inflict harm, Father. Your silence stole your daughter long ago." I reached into the pocket of my stained apron and pulled out a slim digital tablet. It was unharmed, synced to the stellar cloud, and glowing with the cold blue light of reality. I tapped the screen and turned it toward the table. "Under U.S. real estate law, a deed in lieu of foreclosure is already signed and notarized," I said, my voice calm and steady despite the throbbing in my face. "I bought your pride months ago, Mother. I didn't want it to end this way. I came here today hoping for a sliver of the mother I remembered, not the monster you became." Astraea let out a shrill, incoherent scream and lunged for the tablet, her manicured claws reaching for the evidence of her ruin. I stepped back, my shadow merging with Leopold's. I felt a strange, hollow sense of peace. The invisible daughter was gone, and the CEO of Stellar Events was the only one left in the room. "Leopold, call the authorities," I said, handing him the tablet. "I believe there's a clear record of an assault in a high-stakes environment. I'm no longer playing the daughter, and I'm certainly no longer the maid." The metallic tang of blood in my mouth was the only thing anchoring me to the reality of the grand dining room. Leopold's roar still echoed against the vaulted ceilings, a thunderclap that had finally shattered the fragile glass of the Sullivan family's lies. I stood perfectly still, watching Astraea. Her hands were trembling, not with regret, but with a frantic, desperate need to reclaim a narrative that had already turned to smoke. She lunged toward the study, her movements erratic as she clawed at the hidden wall safe behind a portrait of our ancestors. "You think you've won, Phoebe?" Astraea screamed, her voice cracking into a jagged edge of narcissistic rage. She ripped out a folder, her manicured nails snagging on the metal. "You're legally incompetent. I have the filial debt contract. I have the guardianship papers." She threw the notarized document onto the mahogany table, her eyes wide and bloodshot. Bellamy stepped forward, her face a mask of sweating panic as she tried to bolster the collapsing facade. "She's right, Leopold. That strategy Phoebe claims as hers. It was stolen from my private files. She's a thief and a mental patient." I watched them both with a cold, detached pity. They were fighting ghosts in a room that no longer belonged to them. Astraea turned her venom on Leopold, pointing a shaking finger at his chest. "I'll sue you for everything, Leopold Thorne. Conspiracy with a mentally unstable girl to defraud a legacy. Do you hear me? You'll be ruined." Truth is like the dawn. You can close your eyes, but you cannot stop the sun from rising. My mother was shouting at the tide, unaware that the real battle had ended months before she even decided to strike me. I pulled the tablet from my apron, the screen glowing with a calm, surgical blue. "Success is the best response, Astraea," I said, my voice dropping into a low, lethal cadence. "But accountability is the best teacher. I didn't take your money. I simply stopped giving you mine." I tapped a final command on the glass. Simultaneously, the phones on the table began to chime, sharp, insistent alerts that cut through Astraea's screaming like a knife. Bellamy snatched up her phone, her face turning a ghastly shade of gray. "Declined," she whispered, her thumb frantic on the screen. "Astraea, the accounts are locked. Every card, the trust fund, it's all gone." Astraea grabbed her own device, staring in disbelief at the red, access denied banners flashing across her banking apps. They had spent years living on a trust I had been secretly subsidizing through a shell corporation to keep our family name from the gutter. Today, I was showing them the mercy of the absolute truth. I explained the legal reality of piercing the corporate veil with the precision of a surgeon. Because Astraea had used the family estate accounts as her personal vanity fund while I held the underlying debt, the law now recognized me as the primary creditor. "You didn't live on your name, Astraea. You lived on my silence. You lived on my mercy." The technological precision of the lockdown was absolute. I was no longer the maid scrubbing their floors. I was the ultimate gatekeeper of their survival. And I had just closed the gate. The mansion lights suddenly flickered and dimmed, the smart home systems switching to emergency low-power mode under my remote command. The grand hall, once filled with artificial warmth, became a tomb of shadows. I turned to my father, Dalton. He was slumped in his chair, a broken man who had traded his daughter's dignity for a quiet life. I handed him a heavy manila folder. "The veil is off, Dad. You knew about the stellar buyout months ago. You knew I was the Titan, and you stayed silent to keep her happy. Now, the silence is all you have left." Leopold stood by my side, a formidable pillar of witness. His presence reinforced the high-stakes gravity of the moment, a silent promise that the time for games was over. "The authorities are 6 minutes away, Astraea," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "The assault charges for that punch are the least of your worries. The forensic audit of these accounts starts tomorrow." I looked at my mother one last time. I wasn't doing this out of a need for vengeance, but out of a need for boundaries. You cannot set yourself on fire to keep others warm. I stood in the center of the dark room, my tattered gray uniform a stark contrast to their ruined silk. "I will not see you on the streets tonight," I said, my voice calm and unwavering. "But you will not spend another night in this house under a lie. This place isn't yours anymore. It's mine." Freedom isn't just leaving a room. It's making sure the room no longer has power over your name. A police siren wailed in the distance, a lonely rising cry that cut through the silence of the Winnetka snow. Astraea looked down at her bruised knuckles, then back at me. The realization finally hit her like a physical blow. She had no moves left. The board was empty. As the red and blue lights began to dance against the frosted windows, I took a deep breath of the cold air. Police cars tore through the swirling snow in Illinois, transforming the Gothic spires of Sullivan Mansion into a flashing crime scene. I stood on the expansive porch, my breath catching in the biting Christmas air, watching the heavy front door swing open. 2 officers from the Winnetka Police Department stepped into the foyer, their heavy boots clattering, signaling the end of a 15-year drama. The outcome unfolded with an eerie silence, a smooth operation of justice that required no shouting to be felt. I met the lead officer's eyes with a steady, unblinking gaze. My face was still throbbing, the metallic tang of blood a lingering reminder of the punch Astraea had thrown in front of our guests. With a hand that didn't tremble, I presented the digital tablet containing the high-definition recording of the assault. "Phoebe Sullivan," I said, my voice clear and carrying the practiced authority of my boardroom. "I am here to file a formal statement under the Illinois domestic battery statutes." Astraea stood paralyzed near the mahogany table, her manicured hands clutching the lapels of her silk gown. Her social standing, a fragile glass house she had spent a lifetime polishing, was evaporating in the presence of those uniform patches. Dalton finally stepped forward, his face a map of weary desperation. "Phoebe, please," he whispered, reaching out a hand he quickly pulled back. "Think of the family. Have some mercy for your mother." I looked at him, seeing the man who had traded my dignity for his own quiet life. Mercy without justice is just an invitation for more pain, I thought. I am not doing this to hurt her. I am doing this to stop the cycle. Sometimes, the most compassionate thing you can do is let someone face the reality they created. I told the officers, "I am pressing charges. Boundaries are the highest form of love, and mine have been violated for the last time." The click of the handcuffs was the only sound in the cavernous hall. Astraea was read her rights, her face a mask of shocked disbelief as she was led toward the door. She looked at me, her eyes darting like a trapped animal's, but she found no weakness in my expression. I was no longer the invisible daughter. I was the architect of her accountability. As the cruiser doors shut, the silence that followed was the heaviest I had ever known. But the night wasn't over. This was the Black Christmas, the moment the debt finally came due. I turned to Bellamy and Dalton, who were still standing in the ruins of the dinner party. I pulled a notarized writ of possession from my apron pocket. Because the mortgage was in default and I owned the underlying deed through my shell corporation, the family was legally required to vacate the premises. The law is a cold instrument, but it is a precise one. I watched them being escorted out of the warmth of the house and into the biting winter night. They were still dressed in their designer gowns and tuxedos, clutching only the small bags the officers permitted them to pack. Bellamy screamed at me, her voice a shrill cry that was swallowed by the wind. "You've destroyed my career. You stole everything I worked for." I stepped down the porch stairs, meeting her halfway. I handed her a small business card for a legal aid clinic. "The only thing I stole was your ability to lie to yourself, Bellamy," I said, my voice low and steady. "Build something real, something that doesn't rely on my blood, and perhaps we can talk as sisters again. Until then, the Sullivan legacy is closed for business." In a final act of human kindness, I informed my father that I had pre-booked a modest suite for them at a nearby hotel, one I didn't own. I wouldn't leave them on the street, but I was making it clear that they were no longer my responsibility. I had spent 15 years being their fuel. I was finished being the fire. I walked back into the empty mansion, the silence now peaceful rather than oppressive. I found the tattered gray maid's uniform draped over a chair in the kitchen. I picked it up, feeling the rough, scratchy fabric between my fingers. I folded it neatly, a funeral shroud for a version of myself that had finally been laid to rest. It was no longer my identity. It was just cloth. I left it on the table and walked out the front door, the heavy oak clicking shut behind me for the last time. The drive back to Chicago was a journey into the light. As I crossed the city limits, the sun began to rise on Christmas morning, painting the sky in shades of gold and pale rose. Leopold followed in his vehicle, a silent protector and a peer who understood the weight of the night. I arrived at the Stellar Events headquarters, the glass-walled office overlooking Lake Michigan shimmering in the dawn. I stood before the windows, watching the calm blue water. The city was waking up, oblivious to the storm that had just passed. I reflected on the guiding philosophy that had kept me alive during the dark years. You are not obligated to set yourself on fire to keep others warm. Your light is meant to guide your own path first. Success isn't measured by the height of your bank account, but by the peace in your heart when you close your door at night.